Hi, this is Lacey,
And Robin.
and we are in Glasgow, Scotland at COP26. It's Tuesday, so it's Tuesday, right? Yeah, second day we've been here. Good. Week 2, day 2 of the week. So today's content, we attended, like always, the Bloomberg Green set of sessions. I can make that closer so you can see it. Get their magazine, good content. Um, they fed us well, so we should at least give them some customers, I think. So, yeah, great content today. Some fun surprises to me at least, because I guess I didn't read the agenda to see that some people were going to be joining us in that tiny room. But so we're going to talk about sort of take a thematic lens across some of the content that we heard instead of giving a synopsis of different, one person at a time. There was a theme that Robin, you called out sort of across several sessions, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so basically the theme is how there's more and more collaboration between governments, NGOs, and business, and basically business and corporates and investors. And I think that came out really strongly. And that, some of the commentary was that previous COPs, basically there was always the politicians and multilateral diplomacy, and now there's a lot more than just those discussions happening, right? A lot of bilateral meetings between corporations, also like basically big like conglomerates agreeing on standards to do things, and business going further than what government is committing. And basically there's coalitions of the willing, and then there's the first movers, so there's all kinds of different groups emerging.
Yeah. So we heard the theme actually started yesterday. So the CEO of Unilever, whose name is Alan Jope, I think, if I got it right, he talked about, he used the word ambition loop, which usually I might turn my nose up at a buzzword like that, but he was so credible that I appreciated his what he called it. It's essentially a virtuous cycle, but he said, what we see is that government signals to the private sector that they're actually going to move in the same direction in a coordinated manner, and that there will be regulation and taxes or a price of sort of diverging outside of that pathway, and then business signals to the public, to government, that they're going to do something about it, that they're making commitments like only buying sustainable steel. So I don't know what green steel means, right? It sounds a little bit iffy to me, but I'm sure there's some standards behind it. But a company like Volvo committing to buying only
10% of their steel from
right,
green steel, so that they're
signals as well.
Basically it's creating a market, creating a certain demand for companies maybe creating higher price point but sustainable products.
Yeah, and creates an ambition loop, right?
Yeah. And then also we had that session with the Mars CEO and the WWF CEO, right? And they were saying themselves that it was an unlikely pairing.
Yeah, I'll find I loved the term that they used. But yeah, they were definitely quite different personalities, but
and
partnering.
For the Mars CEO, for example, it was his first COP, and clearly, and one of the comments from WWF was that historically Mars was always very quiet on sustainability, right. And now they're essentially working together, where WWF has the role of challenging Mars to do better, but Mars is really up for the challenge and then delivering on that, and then they're really working together. And both Mars and Unilever talked about the example of palm oil and how they're using satellite data and monitoring. Also, what I thought was fascinating was that basically the Mars CEO talked about the procurement relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And how palm oil sourcing before was a commodity business, right? 1,500 different suppliers. And now with ESG criteria, suddenly it's down to 90 partners that are held to very rigorous standards, but also those are now long-term contracts. Right. So the whole nature of the business relationship changes.
I think we should save this topic to procurement and supply chain.
Okay.
But I think it's a good example of how government or how private sector is signaling then back to government that they've got it and they're actually going to fall in line, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the topic was uncommon collaboration.
Yes.
So yeah.
And then also John Kerry, right? He was very inspiring, first of all, and I think he was saying that he was up till 3 a.m. to try to get some unnamed countries, maybe China and India and Russia, into the methane pledge, and clearly very committed. He's been there since the late 80s, or I mean the early 90s was the first COP, right? And to see kind of someone with that experience still like so engaged and driving forward the multilateral agreements. And
I don't remember anything he said. I was just so mesmerized and thrilled to if I can be patriotic, proud to be an American. I got my eyes got a little moist once or twice. It's been a long time for Americans to have. Anyway, so,
I think there were some attempts to get some juicy headlines in terms of maybe putting blame on China or something, but I think the responses were really, really good. Kind of not saying that hey, everything is great, like we're falling short, but between Paris, where I think the expected temperature was maybe 3.7, and now with the current pledges, including the methane pledge, the expected temperature by 2100 would be 1.8 degrees, right? That's a massive change. Obviously, there still has to be, that means massive action will need to follow.
Well, and one of the things then, back to the theme of this discussion, was that John Kerry talked about how government can't do it alone.
Yes.
Right? And so that was very interesting because the interviewer pressured him on how much the U.S. had committed to financing
the infrastructure bill, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And he said, like whatever, 11.2 billion. Did I get my metric right? Was it billion or trillion?
No,
Who knows?
Basically, the infrastructure bill is in billions, but he was saying that there has to be between 2.6 and 4.6 trillion of investments every year. And so his point was no government in the world can provide that level of money. So there has to be private investment that's crowded in. So I was very, very encouraged by basically people realizing the different pieces that have to come together, but also each piece kind of saying, okay, this is the piece that we can contribute, and not pretending like they can solve it all by themselves.
And something I hadn't appreciated until he said that. I mean, I probably could have thought through the logic, but one way to frame that relationship is an ambition loop, right? To say, oh, we inspire each other, but it's quite another thing to say, actually, the government can't do it alone. Like if you're looking to us to do it all, we can't.
Yeah.
We actually need everybody involved.
Right.
It's too big of a task financially, not just like, oh, it's a lot of work, but it costs too much money. We actually can't just leave it up to the private sector because that's a nice thing to do, but actually we need the private sector to do something, because otherwise we'll fail. For some reason, that was a psychological shift in my mind.
Yeah. And on the relationship between business and politics, I thought there were two comments that I found very interesting. First of all, numerous business leaders called for a global standardized price on carbon. Right? Like that's basically Article 6 negotiations that really clearly business like wants that transparency, wants to be able to plan, and wants simplicity, and also the same demand kind of for alignment on energy markets. Also, for example, from Google, how Google signs PPAs, right? Like they want kind of similar frameworks to transact internationally. I mean, that's not going to happen, but in the short term. But basically, the more global we can make the standards, the faster business can act. Right. And the other point I thought was interesting. The Patagonia CEO talked about the fact that there's often a difference between what businesses tell their consumers versus what they tell politicians versus what they tell investors.
What they tell politicians via their lobbyists.
Yes.
So whether they've said that to the lobbyist or the lobbyist just assumed that that's their position, and then they're communicating that message to Congress, I think, or to whatever regulatory body there is, question mark. But yeah, exactly. There's a dissonance between those two messages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Patagonia CEO basically argued that there should be a lot more scrutiny on the alignment between the messages that companies send to these three different stakeholders.
And he came out and said, regulate us. He said, I hate to say that, but the mechanism of regulation, the precursor to that is standardization and transparency, right? So even before you say you have to reduce your emissions, and this is something else that the head of the Hong Kong exchange talked about, because she was asked, will the Hong Kong exchange in the next 5 years require listed companies to be carbon neutral or net zero? And she said, we're not talking about that right now, but just having standardization and transparency is the first step. We're not even there yet. And then whether you tell people they have to, come down to a certain emissions level is the next question. But just creating those first mechanisms, those first steps, is really important. And so I think that's, similar with Patagonia. He said, regulate us, but really it means create a standard so we all know what we're talking about. Yeah. When we use words, we know what those mean, and there's a regulation behind the use of that word.
Yeah. And about the use of words, I thought the Bristol mayor was really, really good. And he said, let's not talk about how do we fund certain initiatives like retrofitting buildings, right? But how do we secure the investments? And let's talk about return on investments. And again, the crowding in of private investments. Because I think there's an acknowledgement that, hey, we cannot do this with grants, right? Again, like governments don't have the money to do this, right? So
plus,
we have
it's not a grant case. Yeah. It's not a case for a grant. There is a return on investment. Yes. There is a downside. There is a risk if you don't do it.
Right. Yeah, and I think in general clean tech sector has gone through so many roller coasters of like sudden subsidies and then the waning of those, and so I think it's a lot more helpful to think of these stable regimes that can facilitate the investment, but government doesn't need to take the investment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're even a bit over the 10-minute recommended length for YouTube. So we'll cut it off there, but we'll come back and talk about procurement, long-term contracts, head of sustainability, head of procurement, how that can work in an org structure in the next video.